Welcome to this explainer. So, on August 2nd, 2026, British journalism lost one of its most recognizable, deeply divisive, and just utterly unapologetic voices. Rod Liddle passed away at 66 after a short illness. Look, whether you loved his writing or couldn't stand it, throughout his decades in the media, he was a guy who was literally impossible to ignore. Today we're going to unpack his life, his incredibly wild career, and that intense polarization he left in his wake. We'll look at exactly what made him such a monumental and, highly controversial figure in British public life.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the central paradox of Rod Liddle's life is actually defined by how other people reacted to him. It's almost like two different realities. To his supporters, he was this fearless truth-teller, right? A total bastion of common sense who absolutely refused to bow to the orthodoxies of either the left or the right. But to his critics, they saw a bigoted provocateur who crossed the line time and time again. Many accused him of racism, misogyny, and basically using his massive media platform to just punch down.
And you really have to look at his trajectory, because it was incredibly fast and honestly highly unusual. You just don't see a career path quite like this one anymore. He started out in the traditional, gritty trenches of local news as a trainee reporter on the South Wales Echo. From there, he pivoted in the 1980s, get this, to become a speechwriter for the Labour Party. By 1998, he had rocketed to the absolute pinnacle of British broadcasting as an editor at the BBC. That is until a dramatic exit in 2002 turned him into a national lightning rod as a columnist for the Spectator, the Sunday Times, and the Sun.
But to really understand the man, we have to go back to where it all started. Born in 1960, Liddle grew up in working-class South Wales. He was the son of a steelworker, and if you've read his stuff, you know he never let anyone forget those roots. That environment deeply shaped him. It forged him into someone who never ever viewed himself as a victim. Instead, he felt he had thoroughly earned the absolute right to speak his mind. South Wales is where he learned his craft, writing in these short, sharp, punchy sentences, always finding that unique angle and relentlessly pursuing the human story.
So that sharp writing soon catches the attention of the Labour Party. He actually spent the 1980s working as a speechwriter for Labour politicians, giving him this incredible front-row seat to the inner workings of political power. But this insider view had a really profound effect on him. He saw firsthand exactly how political language was being carefully engineered to obscure the truth rather than actually reveal it. And that experience, it instilled in him this permanent, deep-seated skepticism of power. It basically birthed his brutal, completely opposite approach to journalism later on, where he was just desperate to strip away all the spin.
Let's look at how that skepticism played out on the biggest stage possible, as we move into Section 1, Reshaping the BBC. In 1998, Liddle landed what is arguably one of the most prestigious jobs in all of British broadcasting. He became the editor of BBC Radio 4's Today program. This is the show that literally sets the daily political agenda. And this brilliantly illustrates his whole vibe, because he wasn't just some quiet administrator sitting in the background. No, he was a fiercely influential editorial force. He demanded a much sharper tone, he pushed his presenters to ask significantly harder questions, and most notably, he wanted interviews to feel like arguments, not just polite little chats. Under his watch, the program became wildly influential, but increasingly controversial too.
And that controversy, it ultimately boiled over. In 2002, Liddle wrote a column for The Guardian, criticizing the then-Chancellor Gordon Brown. Now, the BBC was already highly sensitive to any allegations of political bias, so they issued a strict ultimatum. You cannot continue as editor if you keep writing opinion pieces outside the BBC. His response? He just resigned, walked away. In an instant, Liddle went from being this top-tier establishment insider to a highly dangerous, completely unleashed free agent.
Which brings us to the next and honestly, arguably, most explosive phase of his career, Section 2, the unapologetic columnist.
Totally free from the BBC's strict impartiality rules, Liddle's columns in The Spectator and The Sunday Times were read and, let's be real, often hated by millions. He rarely held anything back on topics like immigration, feminism, or the education system. He was writing things like, "The white working class has been abandoned by the left." To his devoted supporters, this was just pure common sense. They felt he was giving a really loud, articulate voice to working-class frustrations that were largely being ignored by mainstream politicians. Frustrations that, as we know now, would undeniably help fuel the Brexit vote years later. It created this absolutely incredible paradox. Think about it. Here was a guy who used to literally put words into the mouths of Labour politicians. Yet, as his column really gained traction, he found himself entirely loathed by the left he once served while being warmly embraced by the right. It was a massive, sweeping ideological realignment for a public figure.
And from all accounts, it was a shift he didn't just passively accept, he thoroughly enjoyed navigating it.
But this constant, deliberate provocation leads us directly to our third section, and the question that really defined his later career. Where was the line?
Well, the short answer for Rod Liddle was that he fundamentally did not believe in lines. He believed in absolute, untrammeled free speech, completely regardless of the consequences. For example, in a 2014 column, he wrote that the vast majority of Muslim men in Britain saw women as sexually available. Now, when challenged on this incredibly inflammatory statement, Liddle didn't back down. He didn't apologize. He simply claimed he was stating an uncomfortable truth that others were just too afraid to say out loud.
But we absolutely have to look at the immediate, fierce reaction to those words. The Muslim Council of Britain swiftly and unequivocally condemned the column, labeling it exactly what it was to them, bigoted. This back and forth right here, it perfectly represents the immense daily friction of his career. Every single time he published a column pushing the boundaries, it was met with equally intense outrage, with critics repeatedly labeling him a dinosaur and a troll.
And the controversies, they just kept coming. Fast forward to 2019. Right in the middle of all those heated debates over Brexit and the NHS, Liddle publishes this piece claiming that women over 50 shouldn't be allowed to vote because they, quote, can't be expected to be rational about these issues. As you might imagine, the backlash to this specific column was absolutely explosive.
The reaction to this piece perfectly maps the completely divided reality that Liddle operated in. His critics immediately called him a misogynist, pointing to the column as undeniable proof. Meanwhile, Liddle and his defenders, they simply called it satire, just brushing off the outrage entirely. It's also worth noting that his boastful openness about his own complex personal affairs and marriages during this time only served to harden these two opposing views. To his critics, it confirmed all his worst traits. But to his fans, it was just more proof that he refused to play by society's polite little rules.
So let's just pause for a second here. Based on the columns, the reactions, and the deliberate provocation we've just covered, was he genuinely trying to expose hard, uncomfortable truths about society? Or had he just realized that being cruel and shocking was the absolute most efficient way to generate clicks and stay relevant? It's the defining question of his career, really, and as we've seen, the source material offers plenty of evidence for both sides.
Which brings us to the final chapter of his life. Section 4, A Divided Legacy. In his final years, Liddle maintained a pretty relentless pace. He took up presenting a Saturday morning show on Times Radio, kept writing his columns, and stayed a regular fixture on panel shows. But privately, he was battling a severe illness. The combative journalist died on August 2, 2026, at James Cook University Hospital in Middlesbrough at the age of 66. Following his passing, News UK released a statement from his 3 children, Wilder, Tyler, and Emmy. And it offers a deeply personal contrast to the public combatant we've been discussing today. They described their father as inquisitive, brave, and always humorous, and they viewed his legacy as a guide on how to live an extraordinary life.
The industry he worked in for decades also weighed in. Rebekah Brooks, CEO of News UK, praised him as an inimitable journalistic force. Meanwhile, the editor of the Sunday Times, Ben Taylor, highlighted what was perhaps Liddle's greatest professional asset, his unique talent to speak for the readers. They recognized that, regardless of all the controversy, his connection to his specific audience was remarkably strong.
But of course, the story doesn't end neatly. It rarely does. While he received glowing tributes from the very top of the media establishment, a massive wave on social media outright refused to mourn him. Critics pointed to the real pain caused by his statements over the years and offered zero forgiveness. Even in death, his epitaph was perfectly cleanly split right down the middle.
So, the crucial point is, when you look at the entirety of this man's life, from a steelworker's son to the editor of the Today program to a national provocateur, was he brave or was he reckless? Did he elevate our public discourse by forcing us to talk about things we desperately wanted to avoid, or did he damage it by confusing provocation with actual insight?
Actually, perhaps the truest distillation of his entire life is this one simple quote. He didn't want to be liked, he wanted to be read. He lived by the sword of free speech, and he never once asked for a ceasefire. Whether he was a brilliant editor shaping the national conversation or a provocateur whose words genuinely hurt people, his ultimate goal was always just to be heard. And in that endeavor, he absolutely succeeded.
Rod Liddle, 1960 to 2026. As the source material makes incredibly clear, you may have loved him, or you may have completely loathed him, but you undeniably knew exactly who he was. And that leaves us with one final lingering thought to consider.
In today's media landscape, does a relentless pursuit of being heard ultimately serve the truth, or does it just fracture our society even further? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the media you consume.